But back to our mission. As I said earlier, our mission is to make it easy for the government to access cloud services. But what we've learned is that the public cloud has become increasingly more complicated. A couple of years ago, I read this article called Do You Suffer from Decision Fatigue? The basic premise of the article is that every decision that we make over the course of the day depletes your willpower by just a little bit. It doesn't matter if you're trying to decide whether to eat an M&M or decide the color of your shirt. Each one of these decisions takes a toll on you. So what this means is that by the end of the day, it becomes a lot harder for us to make decisions. And instead of agonizing over each individual decision that we make, we start taking mental shortcuts. So, for example, they have found that judges tend to be more strict at the end of the day because the risk of releasing somebody early is much greater than not releasing them early. So, judges tend to be more strict. So it doesn't matter what role you're playing, whether you're a judge or a developer, each decision takes a toll on us. And this is research that's understood from a lot of different perspectives. There's this great book called The Paradox of Choice, which looks at the psychology of the decision-making process and how difficult it is for us to make decisions, especially as the number of choices that we have grows. In behavioral economics, we've seen that people struggle making good decisions even if it's in their best economic interest. So instead of asking someone to enroll into a retirement plan, we automatically enroll them and ask them to opt out. So we provide the good option by default. And in technology, we saw the rise of convention over configuration, especially in the early 2000s, when people got very overwhelmed by editing large amounts of XML files. They started instead baking in good defaults into their web frameworks. This is when we saw the rise of 12-factor apps. We saw Ruby on Rails really take hold. A lot of other languages started adapting simplified, more opinionated frameworks. During this time, we saw that convention over configuration is becoming a lot more dominant in the web space. And there was a strong emphasis on developer experiences. But over the last few years, we've seen developers re-embrace a whole new set of options. Choice was back. The reality was that these frameworks were not keeping up, especially with the rise of new services that were emerging in the public cloud. Suddenly, container and orchestration tools like Docker and Kubernetes became much more dominant. With using Docker and Kubernetes, we were able to stitch together a lot of small services that developers managed themselves. We started seeing developers package these applications as a collection of a lot of smaller microservices. And in many ways, Kubernetes has become the de facto standard for orchestrating complex applications. This shift has had a profound effect on how we think about managing modern cloud services. A couple of years ago, people started referring to Kubernetes as an operating system. In some ways, that may sound hyperbolic, but when you look at the definition of what an operating system is, you'll see that it makes a lot more sense. So an operating system is responsible for managing the storage, the memory, and controlling the input and output of functions. In the olden days, this was just happening in your local machine. But now, this is happening across the network, where your computation, your memory, your storage, all of that can be happening in a lot of different places. And developers have loved this flexibility, but I think it's become too complex again. In many ways, we've become very excited about having this lower level access to computation and to application development. But similarly to how many people are not doing operating system development these days, I think there needs to be a shift. And that shift needs to focus back on the frameworks that support developers. So some of you may know Kelsey Hightower. He's one of the leaders in the infrastructure space. He wrote a book called Kubernetes the Hard Way about setting up your own Kubernetes cluster, and I follow his work very closely. And even he agrees with this as well. He tweeted this out recently, saying, "There's a ton of effort attempting to modernize applications at the infrastructure layer, but without equal investment at the application layer, think frameworks and application servers, we're only solving half of the problem." I think that's why the next shift needs to focus on developer experience. And this is where platform as a service comes back into the conversation. So let's go back to this diagram. Where do we imagine most developments happening in the future? I think it's going to be focused primarily on the application and data space, on the higher level aspects of applications. We're still in the early stages of moving to the cloud. And we're still in the process of migrating a lot of legacy applications. I think we're just getting started. And this is where we're already seeing an increased interest in PaaS. We've had people reach out to us who've said that they're drowning in managing their own custom environments. They now say, I'm willing to give up control for simplicity. And we're seeing platforms like Cloud Foundry moving their backend to Kubernetes, where you get the best of both worlds. This is Chip from the Cloud Foundry Foundation discussing how Kubernetes will be one of many options that you can have for orchestrating your application. Similarly to how your operating system can change the way it manages memory and the way it schedules your application itself should not be impacted by these lower level changes. In the long term, I think PaaS is going to provide developers a consistent user experience while the backend can change. And I think this presents a great opportunity in government. Whether you're buying or building, every agency should consider deploying PaaS. You're going to be able to bake in so much security and compliance requirements directly into the stack and allow developers to focus on the mission and the purpose of their application. I think you'll be able to attract small businesses who can benefit from building on top of a trusted stack. Sure, there can be some projects that require to optimize the infrastructure at a lower level. And if your agency needs those kinds of skills, and has those types of concerns, it makes perfect sense for you to have that option. But as agencies continue to invest in the cloud, we need to make sure that government is able to support the next generation of developers. Like I said before, we love sharing our experience with agencies and businesses. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out. Thank you.